this is a chapter dealing really with just the genealogy of the sons of Noah and their children. And this is where we see all the nations that come out of Noah. Now, what we'll find out is that the information that we see here with all these nations, actually, a lot of this doesn't happen until after the Tower of Babel. And so what you gotta understand when you're reading the Bible is that whoever is writing Genesis is writing it after the fact of a lot of this stuff happening. And so they're writing it knowing all this other information. And so you'll see that a lot of times where it'll have a lot of information. Think of Genesis where it's talking about, it actually talks about in the Garden of Eden, the river Hiddekel. And it talks about that comes out of Assyria. Well, Assyria doesn't even happen until we see in this chapter with Nineveh. And so whoever wrote that knew about that, and obviously under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, you know, that all this stuff was written. And so just to understand that, when we see all these different nations, this is after Babel. This is after the Tower of Babel. And after, because we'll see when we get into chapter 11 that the whole earth was one, of one language, and they were all in one place. And so, but we're going to get into that obviously next week, more so with the Tower of Babel. Now, so we see that obviously all the nations of the earth, it starts at the beginning of the chapter and ends with the chapter, that this is how the nations were divided in the earth through Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So these are the three patriarchs. Everybody goes back to them. All the nations go back to them. This is really, if you want to see where all the nations come from, it comes back to this. It comes back to Noah ultimately, but it comes back to the three sons and also to their sons. So I just want to talk about some of these, more so some of the sons that come out of each tribe, out of each son of Noah, to understand a little bit of where they were dispersed at. You know, because obviously what we're going to be talking about is more so after the Tower of Babel, because eventually they're all, you know, different languages and they all disperse around. But Japheth, in this chapter, it actually calls him Japheth the elder. This is where, remember we were talking about how when Noah was 500 years old, he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But we remember, we found out that that doesn't mean the order in which they were born. In this chapter, it calls Japheth the elder. And remember, in Genesis 9, it says Ham, his younger son. Or what his younger son had done unto him. And so Ham, I believe, that would mean Shem is the middle child. Just by that, that's how I believe that the line goes, is Japheth, Shem, and then Ham. But even in this chapter, we go Japheth, Ham, Shem, you know, as far as what's being mentioned here. But I believe Shem is mentioned next because, you know, Shem, at the end of chapter 11, only his genealogy is even mentioned because he's the most important, because that's who Christ comes out of. But I just want to go through some of this. So in chapter 10, verse 2, it says, the sons of Japheth, so here's going to list the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tyrus. Now one thing to notice there is Magog. It's the only other place that Magog's mentioned besides Revelation 20 and Ezekiel 38 and 39. I have no other information to give you on that besides that, but I'm just telling you that that's interesting, right? Because this nation was there before, and obviously it's a marker to show the end times and all that stuff. But notice in verse 3 there, it says, the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. The one I want you to see there is Ashkenaz. Now, I actually looked this up, okay, because the first thing when I see Ashkenaz, I think Ashkenazi Jew. Because that's what the Jews of today are called, is the Ashkenazi Jews. And so I just wanted to see, okay, secularly, where do they say Ashkenazi comes from? Do you know where they say it comes from? Genesis chapter 10. The etymology of Ashkenazi, meaning the Ashkenazi Jews, the etymology brings it back to the son of Ashkenaz, the son of Gomer, the son of Japheth. So it's funny that we're guaranteed when we come out with this film, The Protocols of Zion, Mountain Baptist Church will be called an anti-Semite church. of course, I preached a whole sermon about Judaism is an antichrist religion. So if that wasn't already, us labeled as anti-Semitic, but what son did this come out of? Was it Shem? It was Japheth. You say, well, the Jews actually came out of Shem, though. Well, why are they called Ashkenazi Jews? Well, there's a theory out there, obviously, as far as where the Jews that we know of today came from. And obviously, I believe that everybody's got Shem in them, and everybody's got, Japheth, and everybody's got Ham. It's just ridiculous to say otherwise. It's just mathematically impossible to not be that case. It's mathematical impossibility that we don't all have Abraham in us, just because of how many ancestors that you'd have to go through once you go back to there. That just the statistical impossibility is astronomical, that you would not have Abraham somewhere in that lineage. And same thing with the three sons. Now, obviously, we know Noah. No one can say that Noah's not in that list, right? That somewhere back in the line, your father goes back to Noah. All of ours goes back to Noah. And so, but I submit to you that Shem, Ham, and Japheth, same thing. Now, that's why saying someone's an anti-Semite is retarded, okay? Because we all come back to that anyway. But now, what is an Ashkenazi Jew? So, even according to their own definition of Ashkenazi, as far as etymology, it goes back to Japheth and not to Shem. And so, you say, well, how then? Why would they be called Ashkenazis then, if they came out of Shem? Well, just a little history lesson. There's a theory, and here's the thing: they don't really know. Like, there's no definitive hey, this is exactly where they came from and all this stuff. And you got to take history with a grain of salt. So what I tell you here, take it with a grain of salt. This is just what some historians have said. But it says that there's a theory that the core of today's Ashkenazi Jews descended from what they say is a hypothetical Khazarian Jewish dispersion. So you say, well, who are the Khazars? Well, the Khazars are basically they were like a kind of a semi-nomadic Turkic people. So Turkey, where Turkey's at. That's where the mountains of Ararat are at. That's where all the churches, the 7 churches of Asia, that was in modern day Turkey. And so they called it Asia in the Bible. We call it Turkey now. The Byzantine Empire, all this other stuff. So anyway, all that to say is that there was these Khazars that were from 700 to 800, and basically they were taken out and they were dispersed into Western Europe, into Germany and stuff like that. Now, where this Khazarian, I guess you would say, culture was in Russia and the Ukraine. And basically, what they say is that the ruling elite of the Khazars, and I'm just going to read to you what they say, what the historians say. It says the ruling elite of the Khazars was said by Judah, Hail Levi, and Abraham something. So it's obviously Jewish name, they're trying to be Jewish names here, to have converted to rabbinic Judaism in the 8th century. But the scope of the conversion within the Khazar Khanate remains uncertain. So basically, again, all this is, they're saying, some people say this, some people disagree with it, but basically the Khazars were in Russia and Ukraine, and basically when they dispersed, they all converted, the elites of that group converted to rabbinic Judaism. Now, we already know what is rabbinic Judaism. The Talmud, this is what the rabbis, this is what the Pharisees, this is the religion that was constructed out of the Pharisaical religion that Jesus condemned. And so basically, what they believe is that this whole group of people, they converted to rabbinic Judaism, okay? And then they were dispersed into Germany, into France, and all the places where that's where they get the name Ashkenazi Jew, because they came out of this Khazarian, type of empire. And so why do you think they wear these funny these Russian hats? You know, they come out, they left brown and came back white, right? And so they came back Norwegian. They came back, you know, like Western European. And so, and when you look at the Bolshevik Revolution that was started by the you know, like Lenin, Trotsky, you know, like the Jewish Revolution and communism that you know, basically took out, you probably heard the story of Anastasia. You know, you think about like Anastasia, they wondered if she died. Well, the Bolshevik Revolution, they killed the whole family and took out the monarch that was in Russia and set up communism. And so, you know, that obviously was a big hit, and then it went into, they were trying to come into Germany. So, I mean, there's a lot of history between this, and I'm not getting into the protocols tonight, but it's interesting. And so, basically, there's this guy that wrote this book called The 13th Tribe, and he kind of talks about this theory with the Khazars, and he didn't write it to be a hit piece against Jews. Why he wrote it, was actually to try to destroy anti-Semitism, because he was showing it wasn't a race, it was a religion. But that's what we believe, right? We're not talking about a group of people just based off their skin color or who their father was. But it's interesting because actually most of the Jews today aren't really even the Jews that were dispersed in 70 AD. They were just converted Jews. That's why they're called Ashkenazi Jews, and Ashkenazi goes back to Japheth. So where, you know, you say, well, where's Ashkenaz then? Probably Russia, Ukraine, because that's where it stems back to, even in the right after Christ. And so, again, you know, with these, you know, we're going into history as far as where these people were. Now, some of these other ones we'll see, you know, are a little easier to see where they're at. But I believe, you know, when you think of Japheth, I think he was more so in the European areas. Most people would say that. But this is just because the Ashkenazi in itself, you think of Russia, you think of all these other things, you think of Ukraine, Turkey, and so that makes sense that when Japheth, his sons, they were going up north a little bit. But then as you go on, you see it says, by these, in verse 5, you know, it talks about Javan in verse 4, the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, and Kittim, and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Now, we know from the New Testament, when it says the Gentiles, the isles of the Gentiles, remember Galilee of the Gentiles? Where was Galilee? Up north of Israel. And so, in Tarshish, that looks familiar too, because we see that actually, we'll talk about that here in a second. So what I'm basically going through right now is just more so, okay, where did these nations come from? Where were they when they dispersed? So we're talking about more so after the Tower of Babel, the dispersion into other languages and other nations. Japheth looks like it was more so like going up towards the north, and so we see that with the Galilee of the Gentiles. I think is a huge clue when we're talking about this is where the isles of the Gentiles, think of the islands. If you just look at a map of where Jerusalem's at and where Israel's at, and even if you were talking about the fact of where did the ark land, it landed in the mountains of Ararat, which is in Turkey, and so basically it sounds like they spread up north, and there's a lot of islands in the Mediterranean Sea and all that. And you think of England, what is England? You know, or Britain, UK, whatever they call that, it's an island, right? You know, and Ireland's an island. You know, there's a lot of islands, so you get the isles of the Gentiles. But the Gentiles, you know, we think of that as a bad word, and I do believe it has a bad connotation because in the Bible, because the Gentiles were not known to be believers. Okay, so that's what. But when you cross-reference Gentiles from the Old Testament, New Testament, and stuff like that, what you find out is Gentiles just means nations. So the nations of the isles of the nations. So basically, the nations that went into the isles, islands. You know, isles is just a shorter abbreviation for islands. And so you can think of Great Britain. You know, that they went up to there. They went up to Norway, or they went up to. Iceland's the one that's up close to there, right? Because Greenland's over here on North America. So anyway. But I just want to show you that with when it talks about Gentiles, I believe it's more so dealing with the nations, in particular the nations of Japheth. And so the nations of Japheth that were more so in like the European, Greece, stuff like that. And so, but in Isaiah 66, go to Isaiah 66, and we did this before where we kind of cross-referenced some passages from Isaiah and also in Romans chapter 15. So Isaiah 66 and verse 19. And while you're there, I'm going to read Romans 15:9. It says, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, for this cause I will confess to thee among the Gentiles and sing unto thy name. In Isaiah 66:19 it says, and I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, to Pul and Lud, and draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. Notice a lot of those places are the exact same that we saw in Genesis chapter 10. Javan, Tubal, Tarshish. And so, but it says that them unto the nations. And then in Romans 15, you're dealing with the Gentiles. So you'll see this a lot. Another one right there in Romans 5:19. You go to Deuteronomy 32:43. So obviously these in Romans chapter 15 are basically quoting the Old Testament. And so in Romans 15:10 it says, and again he saith, rejoice ye Gentiles with his people. And Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43. So in Romans it says, rejoice ye Gentiles. In Deuteronomy 32:43 it says, rejoice, O ye nations, with his people. So you see how you can cross-reference to figure out, okay, what does this mean? Because in Genesis 10, this is the first time Gentiles is ever mentioned. And actually, mostly in the New Testament is where you see the word Gentile. And sometimes, it'll be dealing with heathen, but you got to understand that the nations that were outside of this, a lot of these nations were heathen nations. They were worshiping other gods. But it wasn't just Japheth. It wasn't just the nations of Japheth, because we're going to see with Ham that those are some of the biggest nations that come out of Ham. And it's interesting to kind of see where all this stuff came from. And so when we think of Japheth, we think of more like the nations that are north of where Israel and all that stuff's at. And so you think of going all the way to Great Britain or to Italy or Rome and stuff like that. But then, when we get down to Ham, we'll see where that's at in Shem as well. But Romans, and going into the Gentiles as well, what you'll also see is that in Romans particularly, you notice what it keeps saying, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. But sometimes it says to the Jew first and also to the Greek. See how it uses that interchangeably. Now, Gentile, I believe, is more broad, because Gentile, I think, would encompass other nations besides being Greek. So that's a good key to also see, okay, well, Greek would be pretty much this. If you called Greece Gentile, that would make sense. And so when one of the most famous verses in the Bible is Romans 1:16, where it says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Well, you go one chapter over into chapter 2, in verse 10 it says, but glory, honor, and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, for there is no respect of persons with God. And that's something that we need to, when we think of the Ashkenazi Jews, and we think about all this stuff about being anti-Semitic and all this stuff. Here's the thing, who cares? Who cares where you came from? Who cares what your nationality is? It doesn't matter, because he's made all nations of one blood. And so this whole idea, we all go back to Noah anyway, so what's it matter? And we all go back to Adam, but you could even just look at Noah, and they're always like, oh, we're a Semite and all this stuff. No, actually, you're an Ashkenazi. Now, obviously, I believe that we all go back to that. So the whole argument's dumb anyway, because I believe we probably all have some Ashkenazi in us when you go back to Ashkenaz. And so you think about the fact that when Shem, Ham, and Japheth got off the ark, and they had children, who do you think their children married? Probably their cousins. Do you think they were all just like, no, only your sisters and brothers, don't, no one from, obviously they're probably going to go with cousins at that point. And so everybody's probably intermingled to a certain extent. I mean, even Joseph his wife was what? Egyptian. Moses had the Ethiopian woman. I mean, so throughout the Bible, you'll see how that has been completely not a big point. Now, obviously, the genealogy mattered up to Christ as far as knowing that genealogy to prove God's promise was right and true, that he was going to be of the seed of David and of the tribe of Judah and all that stuff. All his prophecies were going to be fulfilled. After Christ, you know what it talks about genealogies? It says avoid genealogies. It talks about endless genealogies, foolish questions, strivings about the law. All that stuff about the genealogies, they don't matter. And so it's interesting to see the history, though, because this right here, where you see these nations coming out of here, this is absolutely true. If you read a history book, you're taking a gamble. You know what I told you about, like the Khazars and the Ashkenazis? Maybe. It might be true. But I don't know. I wasn't there. And so, but I wasn't there when this happened, but I know God's word is true. But what about Tarshish? So Tarshish, and this is also something that's contested as whether Tarshish is the same as Tarsus. Now, when you look at the New Testament, when you go from Old Testament to New Testament, a lot of times the SH is dropped with just puts an S. And so this happens a lot in the New Testament where it's just an S. Even with Shem. Even in the Old Testament, Shem is just Sem. That's where you get Semite, right? When you go to 1 Chronicles, when it says, Noah, Sem, Ham, and Japheth, it doesn't have the H. And so sometimes they'll drop the H. And so they'll just be an S. So that's very common even within the same language to just have an S or whatever. And so to say Tarsus wouldn't be out of the ordinary, especially when you're going to the New Testament. And so anyway, there's some debate on whether this is the same place. I believe it is the same place. And so go to Psalm 48. And so this will give us an idea of where this Tarshish would have been. What nation would this be? I believe it's Turkey, okay? And Turkey. See that because it actually gives a city in Tarsus that he was from. But in Psalm 48 and verse 7 it says, "Thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind." Now, that tells you something, right? It shows you that it's on the coast of something, right? That there's something there. There's water. Okay, so we're not dealing with like a place where it's just all land around it. Okay, so there's a coast to this. In Psalm 72 and verse 10, that is what it says. Psalm 72 and verse 10. It says, "The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts." Sound familiar with Genesis chapter 10 when we're dealing with Tarshish, but then we're talking about the fact that there's also these isles of the Gentiles. And so there's always this stuff to deal with ships. Jonah, where did Jonah flee to? Where was he trying to flee to? Tarshish. And so in Jonah chapter, so wherever he was going, it had to be somewhere he can get there by ship. And so in Jonah 1, and verse 3, and I know this is familiar, obviously, with Tarshish, but I just want you to see it. In Jonah 1 and verse 3, it says, "But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa. And he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." Now, Joppa, if you understand, Peter, where was Peter? He was in Joppa with one Simon the tanner. And I don't want to do a whole geography lesson here, but this is in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, just obviously there's only one. I mean, unless you're talking about Galilee, because they obviously had ships in that Sea of Galilee, but that's not what we're talking about. Joppa was on where the Mediterranean Sea was, and so Tarshish was somewhere on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if you believe that Tarsus, now that alone should tell you that, right? But if you do take the fact that Tarsus and Tarshish are the same place, then go to Acts chapter 21, because Paul was of Tarsus, and so it actually tells us a city that he was in, that he was from. Now at this time, obviously Paul was a Roman. The reason he didn't come from the city Rome. When he says he was a Roman, the Roman Empire went all the way down into Israel. I mean, it was a big empire, and it was taken over. Greece was taken over. All those places were taken over by Rome. So the Roman Empire was huge. And so, that's why I'll tell you where this is at. It'll make sense. But in Acts 21, verse 39, it says, "But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people." So he says this actually a couple times where he says that he's of the city of Cilicia. Now, the city of Cilicia is actually in the southern part of Turkey, on the Mediterranean Sea. And so it's not Sicily, or not, yeah. And it's not Sicilia or whatever that is, the thing that the boot's kicking. Yeah, every time I read, okay, so, it's kind of like when you read other things and you just think of stuff. Every time I think of Cilicia, I think of the thing that the boot's kicking, but that's not it. You're like, what is the boot? The boot is Italy, okay? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, that's the easiest thing, the easiest country to remember is the big boot. Okay, so anyway, so Tarsus, obviously there's a city in Tarsus called Cilicia, and that city is in what we would call modern-day Turkey, but it was called Asia in the Bible, and that's where you'd have Ephesus and Pergamos and Smyrna and all that, from the cities that or the churches that got the letter from John for Revelation. So we see with Japheth that, okay, we have the Ashkenazi Jews now, but we have Ashkenaz, and and even just from history, it looks like that was more so up into Ukraine, which is above Turkey, and then Russia is above that, and so that empire, as far as the Khazars and all that stuff, it took over a portion of Russia, and a portion of Ukraine, and a portion of Turkey. It's actually a Turkic type of empire. So anyway, so you can see. Okay, well, Tarshish then was also in Turkey, so you can see that a lot of these places, and obviously I'm sure they spread once they got there. So this takes time, they probably just spread out from there and keep going up. And so, but now with the sons of Ham, now this is where you get the big nations. Okay, so obviously later on, Rome and Greece, you had Greece and Rome that were big world empires. But at first, the empires that were, and we'll talk more about this when we're talking about the 7 heads of the beast and what those 7 heads represent, which I believe, Egypt would be one, Assyria would be one, and then Babylon. And those are actually the first 3 kingdoms. They all come out of Ham. And it's interesting that Babylon and Assyria is mentioned in here, and so it's just an interesting thing to see. But we see here first in verse 8 there, and obviously I'm not going through all the sons because it doesn't talk about all these. So some of these nations you're not going to see. And we'll actually see here that Egypt, we don't really see Egypt mentioned in here, but we know that's the first big nation that's mentioned. When we get into Egypt is mentioned in chapter 12. So we have Abraham going down into Egypt. And the whole story with him saying that his wife is his sister and all that stuff. And so Egypt is a nation that's definitely a big nation when Abraham's around. But I'll show you that the Bible definitely says that it's a land in Ham. So it's of Ham. And so, you can look at these names and maybe it's Phut, maybe Maybe he came out of that. But we know that Cush, it says in verse 8, begat Nimrod. Now, this name, I believe Nimrod gets a bad rap, okay? Because Nimrod here, because when you think of Nimrod, that's like a derogatory term that you usually say to somebody, you're a Nimrod, you know? And, but I believe he gets a bad rap. Now, the reason he gets a bad rap because of what kingdom he started, okay? But notice this is the narrator speaking here. It says, Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, if it didn't say before the Lord, I would maybe say, okay, this guy's probably, not a good guy. But I believe this was a good guy. And so you may also wonder, why did Isaac like Esau? Because he was a hunter, he was of the field and all that stuff. And I don't know, maybe there was something to do with that as far as God blessing, someone that was a hunter and that would, I like to hunt. It's not like hunting's bad. And so, but I don't believe he was necessarily a bad guy. And a lot of times these nations that were started, they weren't really wicked people. The nations became wicked. And sometimes good people started really bad things. And you think of like Jack Hyles, who was seemed like a really good preacher. He started Hyles Anderson College, which, nowadays is just a wicked institution that's just churning out a bunch of, watered down, unsaved preachers. Is that his fault? It's probably not a good idea to separate the preaching, like how you send out people into a college instead of a church. But was Jack Hyles bad? I don't think so. I think he did a lot for the cause of Christ as far as just getting a fire of soul winning in Baptist churches. And yes, I don't agree with him on a lot. I didn't agree with him on a lot of doctrine, but all the churches that were influential to me, Jack Hyles had a big influence on them. And so all that to say is that just because the person that started something doesn't necessarily mean they were like a wicked person. Some of the worst things were started on the best intentions. What is it? The road to hell is paved in good intentions. And so a lot of good people maybe started something that wasn't good, and then it just went on from there, and everybody's like, oh, well, he started and he was a good guy, so we have to keep doing it. If that person were to come back to life, they'd probably be like, stop it. It was bad idea. And so anyway, with Nimrod, this is where you get into a lot of weird conspiracy stuff. Okay, you remember we were talking about in Genesis 6 with the Nephilim, and you had like the sons of God coming down, and those were angels that were procreating with women, and then you had these giants and these half angels, half man creatures and all this stuff, and there's this weird stuff. Well, this is where you get into Nimrod and you get into Ishtar and all this stuff. Now, I don't know, maybe there was some kind of god and goddess, and basically Nimrod was like pushing this like whole Ishtar thing, and it goes into all this weird stuff with the Madonna thing with Babylon, and maybe there is some truth to some of this stuff, I don't know. But again, you didn't see any of that in here. Okay, so when you're dealing with a lot of this stuff, you need to really just say, okay, that's interesting, but it's not something you can unequivocally prove, and it could be history. But we'll get into, when I preach my Easter sermon, I'm going to get into Easter and why it's not Ishtar. We're not talking about Nimrod and like Ishtar and his mother and like all these different things with the Tower of Babel and all this stuff. So all that to say is that there's nothing in here about Ishtar. There's nothing in here about like baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven like it talks about in Jeremiah. So obviously I do believe false religion goes all the way back, to the Tower of Babel. But we got to use Bible. And so let's try not to go extra biblical. Don't get into the book of Enoch with all the weird stuff that's in there and like all this other extra biblical stuff. But he did start, it says in verse 10, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babel. So Babel, now what we'll find out is there's a reason why it was called Babel, is because he confounded their languages there. So already that they're talking about something that hasn't happened yet as far as in the story of events here, because this is more so giving a lot of information that actually happens after God disperses all these nations. And so because it didn't get that name. A lot of times you'll be reading through a story and it'll talk about, like, it'll say like Beersheba, and it'll be talking about it, and then it'll say, and then they set up this thing, and that's why it's called Beersheba. So it was calling it that before it even got to the point where it was calling it that, right? Because the narrator already knows. It already knows the beginning from the end. It's like when you're reading the Gospels and it talks about Judas, who was the traitor, and you're like, I didn't get to that point yet, right? You know, and if you're reading it as if you're reading like a novel, you'd be like, you spoiled it, right? It's like you spoiled the ending. But that's not, the Bible's already giving you information before you even get to the point, or you get to that into the story. Okay, so, but he began, this was the beginning of his kingdom, was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So in the land of Shinar is where that was. And out of the land, in verse 11, we'll get into this, I'm going to prove these to you too, but out of the land went forth Asher and builded Nineveh. Now Nineveh is the capital city of Assyria. And so we're going to see that both that we're dealing with Babylon and Assyria in the same chapter. But you may ask, well, where's Egypt? Okay, well, go to Psalm 105. Psalm 105. Because it doesn't mention Egypt by name right here. But I do believe the Bible tells us that it's of Ham. So Egypt came out of here somehow. And so it may have been from other, because it doesn't mention all the sons of Ham and like their descendants. It talks about Cush, and then it talks about Canaan. But it doesn't get into, you know, like Mizraim or Phut, you know. And so maybe Egypt came out of one of those lineages. So it doesn't give you all that information. But in Psalm 105, in verse 23, notice what it says. It says, Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And he increased his people greatly, and made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their heart to hate his people, to deal subtly with his servants. He sent Moses his servant and Aaron whom he had chosen. They showed his signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham. So where is Egypt? In the land of Ham. And in Psalm 106, just to see that again, Psalm 106 and verse 21. Psalm 106 verse 21, it says, They forgat God their Savior, which had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and terrible things by the Red Sea. So where did Egypt come out of? Out of Ham. And so we see actually there's three major kingdoms, and actually the three first kingdoms that are world kingdoms, dealing with Babylon from the very beginning. And what we'll see when we talk about the Tower of Babel is that the Tower of Babel is basically what the end times is going to be, and it's coming full circle back to the Tower of Babel. So that's a quintessential point. Tower of Babel, and then he dispersed all the nations, and we're going to talk about that later, and then he's coming full circle. And so it's interesting that these nations are brought up, but Egypt was at the land of Ham. Well, what about Assyria? Well, in verse 11 of Genesis chapter 10, we see out of the land went forth Asher and builded Nineveh. So Nineveh is brought up a lot, but what you'll find out is Assyria isn't really mentioned until you get into like the kings and all that stuff when you're dealing with Assyria taking out. Assyria actually took and completely decimated northern Israel. They tried to do that with Judah. But remember, Hezekiah prayed and God smote the Assyrians and Sennacherib and all that stuff. And so, but we'll see that Nineveh is in Assyria. It's the capital city of Assyria. But in Jonah chapter 1, we were looking at that with Tarshish. He wanted them to go to Nineveh, but he was fleeing to Tarshish. So obviously those aren't the same places. But it says in verse 1 of Jonah, in chapter 1, it says, Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. So we know the whole story of Jonah, and we know that he didn't want to preach to him. Why didn't he want to preach to him? Because they destroyed his people, right? There's a reason, obviously, and we're not preaching on Jonah tonight, but there's a reason why he probably didn't like the Assyrians. Because they were taking out, they've oppressed his people. And obviously God, he had mercy on them in Jonah, but then in Nahum, he took them out. They eventually were taken out. And Nineveh is actually a strong picture of Babylon falling. The same type of language dealing with Nineveh's destruction, the great city, Nineveh. It's even called the great city. What is Babylon called? The great city. And there's a big parallel between that and the Babylon that's going to come. I believe Nineveh is a Babylon that fell. And all these major cities that fell, when you deal with the fall of Babylon itself, with Nebuchadnezzar, but it was with his son, or his grandson, and then with the Persians, and then with the Grecians, and then with the Romans, and then at the very end, there's going to be a Babylon that falls, the ultimate Babylon. But in 2 Kings chapter 19, we'll see that there's no doubt that Nineveh is in Assyria. But if you read the minor prophets especially, you'll see that. We'll see that with Nineveh and Assyria and how they're linked, and how Nineveh is the capital city of Assyria. It's like Samaria was the capital city of Israel. With Syria is a different nation than Assyria. If you don't believe me, I believe it's in 2 Kings chapter 16, but I don't have that written down, where Assyria is fighting Syria. So they are definitely different countries. But in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 36, it says, "So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh." So he's the king of Assyria, and he came back to his country, because obviously we know that what happened to Rabshakeh and his armies after God, was taking it out on them for basically saying, "Who is your Lord? Who is your God that's going to deliver out of our hand?" And so we know the story with Hezekiah. Go to Zephaniah, just one more to kind of show you and prove you that. So actually what we see here more so is the cities are mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 to really show us what nation we're talking about. So it talked about Nineveh. It said Asher, so I imagine that's kind of where they got the name Assyria from. But be careful with that, because Asher is actually also a descendant of Shem. So there's actually two different Ashers. So when you look up Asher, so it's probably mostly going to be dealing with the one that came out of Shem, the person. Okay, and so, but I believe that that's very similar, Asher and Assyria. So you can see how they usually name the country after the person. The Israelites, the Canaanites, right? There's a reason why they're named that. But in Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 13, Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 13, and both Nahum and Zephaniah are going to mention Nineveh a lot. But in verse 13 there it says, "And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness." If you look at Nahum chapter 3, it talks about the oppressing city, the bloody city, and talking about Nineveh. And so that's where you really get a lot of parallels in both Nahum and Zephaniah, dealing with stuff that's very similar. We talked about this when we were talking about the fall of Babylon, about Nineveh and Assyria. But we saw Egypt is of the land of Ham. Assyria clearly was of the land of Ham. But also Babylon. Now that's a no-brainer, because we were just talking about Babel. But the big key there is where it says that it was in the land of Shinar. So in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 10. So Genesis 10:10, it says, "In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel," and then it says, "in the land of Shinar." Now Shinar is a marker as far as where that's at. Go to Daniel chapter 1. Now if you know Daniel was of the captivity of Babylon, and he was taken into captivity and brought to Babylon with his friends. And so that's how the story starts. And so we'll see where Babylon's at. Now I used to think that Shinar was a city, but I don't believe that. It actually says it's the land of Shinar. So Shinar, it looks like Babel, Erech, and Akkad and Calneh were all in the land of Shinar. That's the way I read it in Genesis 10. That Shinar was like this bigger area that was made up of these four places. But in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1 it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now these are the same treasures that Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5 comes out and starts drinking out of. Remember the writing on the wall? And so where were they at? In the land of Shinar. That's where Babylon was at. So what we have is these major kingdoms. Now Babylon doesn't really come to power. After the Tower of Babel, where the Tower of Babel's at is in Shinar. We'll see that next week, that it's in Shinar. But that kingdom of where that's at, because obviously a lot of people dispersed and apparently some people stayed right where that was at, but that kingdom actually doesn't come to power until later, as far as like a world power and like one of the dominant powers. And so what I believe you have first is you see Egypt. That's predominantly mentioned. When you think of Genesis 12, what's the first big nation you're dealing with? Egypt. And obviously there's other nations that you're dealing with throughout there. You're dealing with when they were dealing with the Philistines and the Canaanites and all that stuff, right? But when you're dealing with the major kingdom that everybody was wanting help from is Egypt. And so Egypt is the big kingdom. Then you get into after Solomon and after Rehoboam, and you get into the kings a little further, what's the big kingdom? Assyria. And then after Assyria is taken out, what's the big kingdom? Babylon. And obviously we know from Daniel that it progresses after that to, after Babylon you have the Medes and the Persians, and then you have the Grecians. And we know from modern history that what comes after the Grecians? The Romans. So it's interesting to see all this and see where they come from. And so I know this is a chapter just on genealogies. So obviously I'm trying to make it interesting. I'm trying to make it informative, okay? Because it's not really a preachy sermon, as far as what's going on here. But just to give you some, some meat. So when you come back and you're trying to figure out where these nations come from, this is where they come from. And so, Japheth is more of the Gentiles up in the north. Ham, you're dealing with Babylon. Where was Babylon? Well, they say, Babylon is more so like where Iraq is at. Persia is more where like Iran's at. We know where Egypt's at, right? No one's going to dispute where Egypt's at. Assyria was more north of, because if you think the Assyrians came from the north, right? The Assyrians came from the north. They were above Israel. And so, in the Canaanites, where were the Canaanites at? That's where Israel's at. So the Canaanites, obviously, that's what Israel took over. And so they took that whole area, really, with the land of Ham. Now Shem, when we get into Shem, it doesn't really tell us a whole lot as far as where they were at. What's interesting, one of the things that's interesting with this is it talks about Uz. It says the children of Aram was Uz. Do you remember Job was in the land of Uz? So Job, unless there's another Uz, right? But Job was in a land of descendants of Shem. So that's interesting. We know that Job, a lot of people believe that Job was one of the oldest books written. So Job was before Moses, and it could have been like right after the flood. It could have been right after the Tower of Babel that Job was in the land. And no coincidence that Shem obviously is a line where there's a lot of believers, right? Because then you get into Abraham and all those faith is the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. I believe there's an unbroken chain. Noah was saved. I don't know if all his sons were saved, but I definitely believe Shem was probably saved. And that was passed down to certain groups of people, and there's always a chain of saved people. I don't believe that ever got broken. If it did, then none of us are saved. Okay? And so all that to say is that it's not a big coincidence that one of the greatest, Christians, and I'll say that because it's true, that, they believed in Christ back then too. But Job was one of the greatest men of God. I mean, Noah, Daniel, and Job, those are the three people that God mentions in one of the cases where he says, those are the only people I'd save out of this land when I'm going to destroy it. And so Job was a great guy, and it says he came out of the land of Uz. He was in the land of Uz. So we see that, out of Shem. And so, but you see Asher in there. So in verse 22, it says, the children of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. So Asher, so be careful, when you're looking at that. There's definitely a lot of that in the Bible. We saw that in Genesis 5 when we were dealing with genealogies there, and how, like with Cain and he had some of the same names in there. And so just be careful when you're looking up these names and you just put it into eSword. It's not always going to just like pan out to what you're looking for. So, but what I wanted to show you there is, so Arphaxad and Selah, those are the ones that we're looking at as far as an Eber and Peleg. That's the genealogy of Jesus. So there's obviously, this is an important genealogy, and it actually goes into greater detail of the genealogy in Genesis 11. But the interesting thing to see there is in verse 25, where it says, "And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg." Notice what it says, "For in his days was the earth divided." Now it's interesting that it says that. Now what I believe this is saying is that in the days of Peleg was when Babel was divided, when they dispersed all the nations. And so, because notice at the end of the chapter it says, in verse 32, "These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." Now the question is how long were they before they were divided? Because you'd ask yourself, well, when did the Tower of Babel, when did that happen? Did it happen right after the flood? Well, if it happened if this is true, in the days of Peleg is the great-great-grandson. Wait. Arphaxad is the son of Shem. Grandson, great-great-grandson, yeah. Yeah, so Peleg is the great-great-grandson of Shem. So if you look up the genealogy in chapter 11 there, and I got it written out anyway in Numbers, but you know how we were doing the age of the earth and we were figuring out how old the earth was? Well, if you do that up to Eber, so when Eber he didn't give birth, but when he had his son, Peleg, he was 43 years old. Well, if you add up the dates from when the flood happened, so Arphaxad was born 2 years after the flood, right? And then you have 2 years there, then Arphaxad was 35 when he had Selah such and such, right? It comes out to 110 years. So Peleg was born 110 years after the flood, and in his days was the earth divided. So at least was 110 years before. And you got to think about that. All these people coming together, and all this stuff is going on. But it took about 100 years or so before they all were starting to build this tower in Babel. And so 110 years go by. And so that's interesting because when you think of like modern history and when it started, it took about 100 years for there to be civilization, to be something to even be recorded. And then at that point is when you have all these nations going out, and most of these nations go back to about when we looked at our timeline, like 2500 BC. So it's interesting because it all lines up with as far as what they find in history and how far it would go back, with like Egypt and Assyria and all these different nations. And so definitely interesting when you're dealing with these genealogies that there's definitely information in there. When you're looking at First Chronicles, there's information in there. And there's been times where I was going in there to look for information. And it's like when you think of an encyclopedia, you're not necessarily reading it. Now I recommend reading the whole Bible. And I don't recommend just skipping genealogies. I recommend reading it all. But when you think of textbooks like encyclopedias or concordances or stuff like that, right? You're like, I'm not going to sit down and read it, but it's useful when you know when you're trying to look for something specific. That's when it's really interesting when you find these passages. You're like, man, I'm glad this is here. I'm glad this information is here. And there's been so-called contradictions in the Bible. And those genealogies and chronicles and stuff like that have helped to answer those so-called contradictions. Now, obviously, it still wouldn't have been a contradiction anyway, but it helps you answer it because it gives you more information. And a lot of times it has to deal with, was it his son or was it his brother? Or was it, because sometimes it'll call someone their brother and it's actually their uncle, right? And so a lot of times these genealogies will help clear it up to figure out exactly who it was. Was it his uncle or was it his brother? And so because it's his dad's brother, right? And so sometimes it uses that type of language. And so don't just gloss over when you read these chapters, because there's actually a lot of information dealing with the genealogies and actually nations here. Especially as we get in, as we're at the very beginning of Genesis here, there's a lot of information that when you get into Assyria, when you get into Babylon, when you see Shinar, automatically what are you going to think of when you hear Shinar? When you read Zechariah and you hear this crazy story about this woman and how she's carried by this woman, with stork wings and the ephah and the lead of talent, and all this stuff, and it talks about taking it to Shinar. Well, at least out of that, all that craziness that you're reading there, and all that cryptic stuff, you're like, I know where Shinar is. It's Babylon. And so that type of stuff will help you. When you see just Nineveh, you're just like, okay, we're talking about Assyria. And when you read through First King or Second Kings and stuff like that, and you're talking about Assyria, and then you read Jonah, and you're like, okay, I can understand why Jonah probably doesn't want to preach to these guys. It's not necessarily that he's racist, okay? That's where we're like, oh, he's just a racist, Now, it's probably because the Assyrians killed a lot of his people, and he didn't want to see them get, redeemed from God. And so that type of stuff, just understanding where these nations are, understanding geography a little bit, to understand a little bit about that. And the Bible is obviously the ultimate authority and the ultimate thing where you're going to say, okay, this is exactly right, this is true. And obviously, I'm not against going to the maps and trying to figure it out and trying to go into secular history to try to see if it matches up. Because it's not all going to be, there's no maps in here, okay? There's no inspired maps of the world. And so you got to more so kind of try to visualize it in your mind. When it says it's north or it's east or it's west, right? Also, notice Joktan, how many sons he had. That's a lot of sons there, right? So Joktan, he's almost going up there with He-Man. I think he's got 13. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He has 13 sons. He-Man has 14. So he doesn't beat He-Man. And not the guy that was on the cartoons back in the 80s, okay? There's actually, He-Man was actually a singer. He was like Asaph. But he had 14 sons and I think 4 daughters. Anyway, but I just thought that when I was reading that today, I was like, man, that's a lot of sons. I didn't realize Joktan had that many sons. And so anyway, it's good to have a lot of sons, good to have a lot of children. And so it's definitely interesting. We're going to get more into the Tower of Babel, so I didn't want to go too far into that with the Tower of Babel, because that's what our sermon will be next week, mostly dealing with. And so, but this gives you a lot of information what happens after that. What happens after the Tower of Babel and how those nations were dispersed and where did they go. And so with Shem, it's kind of interesting because you don't really see where they go. But where was Abraham from? Or the Chaldees. What are the Chaldeans usually synonymous with? Babylon. The Chaldeans, right? The Babylonians. And where was Laban from? What was Laban called? Laban the Syrian. And so Syria could have been a place that was more and maybe Chaldean, but it seemed like Shem and Ham were really close together. Does that make sense? As far as the nations go, that they were kind of intertwined with them a little bit. Because Ham really gives us more of a distinct, here's the nations, right? You had Babylon, you had Assyria, you have Egypt, and you have these other places. You have the Canaanites, right? You have Canaan. But with Shem, you don't really have okay, you have Uz. Okay, we talk about the land of Uz. Okay, but where's that at? I don't know. And so there's not a distinct place. And so it's almost like they've been sojourning until they got Israel finally. But it's just interesting to see that. And then Japheth is more, when you go up north with those kingdoms. So anyway, I think that's interesting. But that's Genesis chapter 10. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for tonight and pray that you be with us as we go home. And Lord, just thank you that even in a genealogy, even in just a list of names and their sons, and Lord, just so much information that we can glean from that. and use that throughout the rest of the Bible with our Bible reading to understand where some places are at when we're reading it. And Lord, help us to always view every chapter of the Bible as important, even the ones that are a little harder to read or ones that we would think to be a little more dry. And Lord, we love you. I pray all this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.